this will probably not take very long, I hope. But just kind of wanted to walk through the budget for 2024 and give everyone a chance to kind of ask questions. We are going to do this at the Presbytery meeting next week, but I hope to make it a little bit shorter presentation next week, and not get quite as much into the weeds as far as how the Presbytery budget is set up. This was my first year going through it. It is not Chris. It's not Chris Martin's first year. It's, I don't know how many Presbytery budgets you've been part of making, Chris, but for Elizabeth and I, this was our first year doing this. So there are a couple of things that I learned along the way and was able to understand some things that I previously had not understood. So we will go ahead and dive in with this question. So what's new for 2024? Not much. The overall structure and overall focus of the budget really remains the same as previous years. We did not blow anything up. We made some, I think, some important changes, but nothing major in how we structure or set up our budget for the Presbytery. So this is the overall budget that is being proposed for the Presbytery, and what I want you to pay attention to here are the bolded lines, not necessarily the 5 lines in between, but we have a budgeted income of a little more than $1.5 million, a budgeted expenses of a little bit more than $1.5 million, and for a projected difference of $455. So what's before you today is basically a designed balanced budget. Of course, in a budget this size, there's going to be some difference one way or the other, but this is kind of the overall the overall picture is that this budget is balanced. You can see those subcategories. We're going to get into what support to congregations and support beyond congregations means, because that can be a little confusing of 2 categories. But ecclesiastical cause, GA synod per capita, and personnel expenses. And what you can immediately see is that the vast majority of our budgeted expenses is in those personnel lines. But to get a better look at that, it's easier to look at it, I think, if we look at it this way. So let's take a look at our income. Our income comes principally this year from 6 different sources. Our single biggest source of income remains our per capita, which is about $736,000. Now, the question that always comes up is that what is could be collected, or is that what we project we will collect? And that is a projected actual number, not what is technically due, right? So that is a number based on how historical trends and percentages and things like that. That's roughly what we can expect to actually receive in per capita payments in 2024. Our next largest source of income comes from our endowment withdrawals calculated. That's just shy for 2024 of $400,000. That uses a standard percentage of the 5.25% of a 12-quarter rolling average of the investments that we're allowed to draw on. And that's our second biggest source of income. And that, again, that's our calculated withdrawal using the standard formula. The next one, though, is that we do, and we've done this for a number of years, take a draw above and beyond that to supplement our income. And that's that line, endowment withdrawals additional, which this year is budgeted at $160,250. So real stickler on endowment policy would say, well, that's not a good idea. You shouldn't draw above your calculated percentage. And on one level, that's true. On the other level, when we look at this and when we look at how we are managing our investments, and this is where I'll defer to Chris, this is still well within the safe zone as far as withdrawals. So this doesn't get us anywhere close to withdrawing, 10, 12, 15% in a pattern that becomes clearly unsustainable, right? This is a couple percentage points over 5.25, but not even into the double digits on our withdrawals. So we're still well within the safe zone as far as drawing on our endowments. Chris, do you want to add anything to that?
No, you're absolutely correct. We're still within the legal limits by Act 141, which is somewhere between 2 and 7%. And the next line item will be the very interesting one, 72,000, which we, even though we show it, we don't tend to take it because our cash flow is good.
Yep.
Did I still steal your thunder, Brian?
No, a perfect segue. So, and as Chris said, our next line is short-term investments. The nice part is even if we over budget for an additional withdrawal and we take it, and we turn out to not need it, as Chris said, there have been years that $72,000 line, that short-term investment income line, we've just left it in place. So some people will sometimes say, well, shouldn't we be more conservative in our draw from our endowment? Perhaps, but we have a fail-safe where, hey, if we don't need the money, we just leave that 72,000 sitting there. The other one is other income. That's kind of basically a lot of our rental income, and I want you to keep that $66,000 number in mind because we're going to come back to that number later. So any questions on the income side of the Presbytery budget?
If you have short-term investments that you don't spend, do they feed back into the endowment?
Yes.
Thanks.
Basically, Mark, short-term investments are bond issues,
Okay.
short-term bonds. And as you know, they're trending higher. In fact, the Fed said yesterday there's going to be another one before the end of the year. So we're doing well in that aspect.
Okay. So that is our investment side or our income side. Let's take a look at our expenditures. As I said, our single largest expenditure, that is for personnel, it's about $800,000 total. Our next biggest category is GA and Synod per capita. And the reason why, by the way, that we have to put this in the budget is that although that is money that technically we just pass on, that's collected from congregations, because we are required to remit the full amount to GA and Synod regardless of what we actually receive, we have to put it in our budget rather than just saying it's a pass-through, right? Well, like we don't need to account for that. We do need to account for it in our budget because we will not receive that 252,000, and we'll have to make that up from other sources. Our next big expenditure is Crestfield support. Starting in 2016, we adopted a covenant agreement with Crestfield that has a scheduled level of support that declines $10,000 per year up through 2031 or 2032. I can't remember the final year. For this year, our Crestfield support is $70,000. So not an insignificant amount of money, but also not the 150 it was when we started the agreement. Property expenses are budgeted about $68,000. That's, of course, a moving target depending on a lot of factors of utility costs and things like that. But remember how I wanted you to keep in mind the other income line of 66,000? Well, what you'll find out is the other income line of 66,000, that's mainly rental income, just about equals the property expense line of $68,000 income. So we roughly, again, there's some wiggle room there, but we roughly offset the cost of the building with money with our other income. So it's basically a wash as far as actual cost for the building when we factor in what we bring in for rentals. Our ecumenical partnerships, this is money that we give to organizations like Christian Associates and groups like that, and the State Clerk's Office. That's funding that covers Carla's expenses related to basically the ecclesiastical processes. This year it's a little higher because it's a General Assembly year, so there's greater expenses for the State Clerk. So this is one category of our expenses for personnel, GA Synod, Crestfield Property, Ecumenical Partnerships, and State Clerk's Office. However, the other big chunk is actually money that is then given to our ministry teams and our commissions to help carry out the work that they are called to do. The single biggest program line, right? So our single biggest line is personnel, no doubt about that. Our single biggest program line is for New Worship and Community Support, and it's $100,000 a year. And what basically that covers is that allows us to supplement the income, and in large part cover a lot of the income for our leaders who are doing New Worship and Community work, who are planning those new churches. And that's our single biggest program line. The actual commission expenses, I'll tell you, are about $5,000 a year. The rest of it is pretty much all helps to pay for our New Richmond community leaders and the work that they are doing. Our second biggest line is ACT, Administrative Commission on Transformation. ACT mainly does two things with those funds. Number one is that they provide direct grants to established congregations. They're called transformation grants. It's a matching grant up to $4,000 a year for projects designed to enhance a congregation's ministry. These have been all over the place. There's been all kinds of different projects from buying new tables to rehabbing physical spaces to enable after-school programs. They have done all kinds of different programs. During COVID, ACT did a $1,500 technology grant that bought a lot of cameras and bought a lot of live streaming equipment. So this is one of the ways in which, as Presbytery, we've been able to respond pretty quickly to needs of churches for financial assistance. Our next biggest line is what we call equipping resources and ministry accounts. This is actually an area where we've made an increase that I'll talk about at the end. But these are things where we purchase shared resources to be used by all our churches. This is where we draw funds to host training events and fellowship events. Like those types of things are either paid for or supplemented by this line. The Justice Ministries line, this covers the work of the Peacemaking Ministry team and Freedom Rising and Amos 524. This is actually a kind of catch-all category. There's a lot of different sublines here. But this is one area that this year has seen a pretty significant overhaul. We realized in the budgeting process that we hadn't actually looked at the Justice Ministries individual budget lines since Ralph joined the staff. And so Ralph has done some refiguring of kind of reallocating how these individual lines are. The actual bottom line hasn't changed. It's still $11,750 from last year's budget to this year's, but he's trying to better align it to support initiatives like congregations who are doing signed on to Matthew 25 and things like that. So this is an area where actually there's been a lot of changes, but not in the actual bottom line cost. Just trying to align it to where our Justice Ministries work is now compared to where it was before Ralph started, which is really the last time that this had been looked at all. Our Next Generation Ministry budget line, that covers the ministry team I work with most closely for children and youth. This helps pay for our fellowship lunches, for training events that we host, and things like that. The Executive Committee, and then pretty much these next three, these all kind of supplement and underwrite the regular costs for these committees to do their work. Executive Committee helps cover the cost of our retreat. For Commission on Preparation, that helps supplement the cost for our candidates who are going through the entering ministry assessment and getting their psychological exams. We cover a portion of that cost. It helps defray the cost of refreshments for meetings and things like that. So those three commissions, while they're really significant in the work that they do within the life of the presbytery, their actual budgets are very small because the actual committee operations don't end up being that expensive. The next two, international partnership and the mission ministry team. For international partnership, again, this helps cover some of their costs that they incur for hosting those coming from Malawi, for going to Malawi. This year, they actually used the majority of those funds to provide direct assistance to Malawi during the flooding. And then last, we split out our administrative costs between kind of the two sides of our budget. In general, administrative costs for us total are $83,000, and that's a catch-all for all kinds of things, from copier leases to all kinds of just buying paper products for the bathroom, that kind of stuff. All the stuff that's not boring and no one gets excited about, but you have to have. We all kind of just lump that into one line of the administrative costs. So any questions on expenditures before I move on? I'm going to jump back to the first one and just kind of flip back and forth. So
Brian, I do have a quick question. What churches are represented under New Church? Like who all is under that umbrella at this point?
For New Richmond communities?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's four. So we have the Commonwealth of Oakland, Harbor Online, East End Youth Ministry, and Hazelwood Hope. are our 4 active New Worshiping communities right now.
East End, what was that? Sorry.
East End Youth Ministry.
Okay.
Can you, I am familiar personally with Hazelwood Hope and Commonwealth. Can
Yeah.
you summarize the other two real quickly?
Sure. So East End Youth Ministry is a project of Beulah Presbyterian Church, and
Okay.
what they're trying to do. So Alex Rozanek is their director of youth there. What Alex is trying to do is to shift youth ministry from what I would call is a church-based model, where your primary interaction is with kids who are associated with your church, into a community-based model, where he's collaborating with other congregations in the area. And they've been really, really successful by every metric in starting new programs. So they do an after-school program, and then they run a pretty well-attended summer camp that has gotten quite a bit of traction. And when I mean traction, I mean like grants from the county to help cover staff.
Great.
But again, here's the simplest way to put it. The kids who are coming to Beulah for that program are not Beulah kids. They're not kids who are connected to the church directly. They have been able to tap into a very different kind of way of doing that work. Harbor is a really interesting project. Harbor is an entirely online community. It was started by a guy by the name of John Matthew, who attended Pittsburgh Seminary. He now lives in Chicago, but because it's an online community and it got its start here, it's still one of ours. But they meet entirely online. At this point, they are not just they literally are now a multinational. Their most recent kind of joinee is actually from Brazil, and is connected to Harbor. But they have started, they just did their first in-person event here in the States to kind of gather people together. So it's a really interesting project. This one, both Harbor and East End we're cooperating with the UCC. So those are actually shared projects between us and them. Commonwealth is ours, and Hazelwood Hope is just ours as well. So those are our 4 current ones right now.
One more question about that. When I was on New Church Development, we had a tiered, I think it was a 4-year letdown on funding over time.
Yep.
Is that still in effect? And where are those 4 churches in terms of, I'm just kind of given the size ticket it is here, just kind of like, what's that mean for subsequent years?
Yeah, great question. So the strict formula, Mark, that you would be familiar with, we kind of had to throw out during COVID because everything got messed up, right? So in some ways, we're kind of at a reset point, and sustainability is actually one of the things. We actually just had a conversation at our meeting on Wednesday about that exact thing of how are we going to how do we encourage the sustainability pieces? One of the main ways that sustainability is kind of being built into the system is through the 3-tiered grant structure. So nationally, the level 1 grant is called the seed grant. And the seed grant is a $10,000 grant. I joke, but I'm not kidding. If you've got a decent idea that could be a New Worshiping community, we can probably get you $10,000. And then the commission matches the money. So we've had a couple communities that have kind of fizzled, but they started out with $20,000, did some experimenting with it, figured out they weren't going to make something of it, and then those funds reverted to us, right? So we keep those funds in-house, right? So we don't lose them. But that's kind of tier 1. The next one is the investment grant. And that's when a community is showing some traction, getting some kind of clear mission and objectives. But one of the questions is what is your internal giving? What is your internal support that you're developing? The third level is the investment grant. And the investment grant's the hardest to get. You have to show quite a bit of internal stewardship. And you have to really show that, hey, we've got regular patterns and practices. We've got buy-in. We're supporting different organizations besides ourselves. What that does is, because you go through that grant cycle, it kind of naturally builds in early on. You get presbytery support and grant support from 1001. Once you get through the 1001 grants, now it's time to really start thinking about what the sustainability is going to be for these communities. So where are we? Hazelwood Hope is at the end of their grant cycle, but they are a very, very lean operation. Their annual budget's about $8,000 a year to operate. So they're very, very lean, very simple. Part of it is that, you know, their main population that they're gathering is at a senior citizens high rise in Hazelwood.
Okay.
So they're never going to really develop a whole lot as far as internal giving. Where we're working with them, though, is eventually getting them moved and nested within the life of one of our other congregations and gaining financial support from neighboring churches. So they are never going to charter as a self-sustaining congregation. Well, it's not. Their future is going to be as a ministry of another congregation, financially supported by other congregations. Commonwealth is just received their investment grant. So they are kind of at the end of the grant cycle. They also, the other piece for them is that they get $50,000 a year from the ongoing Belfield settlement, because the Belfield settlement was designated in part for ministry in Oakland, which is where they're doing work. So they're through kind of the grant cycle. They've got the Belfield support, but I would say is they're kind of at a midpoint of, like, they're enough into it that they've got some good internal financial support. They did a fundraising campaign this year that closed a pretty significant budget gap. So they are moving in a good direction. One of their pastors is going out to Stewardship Kaleidoscope in October for exactly this reason. Like realizing that this is something that they've got to work ahead on now that they've exhausted the grant cycle through 2001. What we know is on our end, particularly because of COVID, we're going to have to be more lax on kind of how long the commission provides support for these communities. Our old guidelines say 5 years. And we're pretty convinced that if we back up and start the 5-year clock where Commonwealth technically started, they're basically hosed because so much got disrupted for them during COVID. So we're now looking at a little bit different window of probably 5 to 10 years. And what's interesting is that if we look back at, like, even into the 20s and 30s, when Pittsburgh Presbytery was planning new churches, even then 10 years was kind of the normal cycle of support that came direct from the presbytery. So we're not actually without precedent there. Harbor's even more interesting because they have UCC funding and us. They're actually well on the path toward being sustainable. They're not quite there yet, but because of they have very low overhead, right? They need a Zoom account. But they have received their growth grant. They have not done the investment grant yet. East End's at the very beginning. They haven't even done their growth grant yet. They only have done their seed grant. So they're just beginning into that cycle. But again, they receive a lot of support from Beulah because Beulah is helping to pay part of Alex's salary. So probably more detail than you wanted, but that's the rundown.
No, that's actually, that's really helpful. Thanks, man.
Yeah, I mean, part of what I'll say is, like, having Vera White on the New Richmond Communities Commission means that sustainability and stewardship will always be at the forefront of our conversations, because that's one of the first things that she says is, what's your sustainability plan? They're like, we've been at this 8 months. She's like, I know. What's your sustainability plan?
You know, I was just thinking too, Brian, that at some point, either in the P News or on the floor of Presbytery, it would be really good for everybody to hear that summary, because, you know, outside of that, you just kind of have only the vaguest notion of what's going on with new worshiping.
Yep, I agree wholeheartedly. That's good.
This is why I wanted to do this, because this is the feedback that I need as someone who's never done this before. Yeah, I mean, we're going to get an update on Commonwealth at this meeting next week, but yeah, that is good feedback. I appreciate that. Other questions on the expenditure side? Okay.
I do have one.
Yeah, go ahead.
So one of the issues that came up in an early discussion with the EC group, was kind of vague, was this idea of whether our drawdown from the endowment was sustainable.
Yeah.
And I heard everything you said, but going further out into the future, is there a plan for trying to reduce the additional drawdown, or, what's the story on that?
Good question. So we have actually reduced our draw significantly over the last couple of years. So
Okay.
our additional withdrawal within even the last 5 years was actually $250,000. So even where we are now, we're down about 100,000 of what we've taken as an additional draw. So we are being mindful that, one of the reasons why we have kind of continued to reduce staff on our end, right? When I joined the staff, we had 10 full-time employees, and we had 10 full-time equivalent employees, and now we have 7.5. The main reason that we've been able to reduce our drawdown has been that we have continued to kind of reduce staff, fortunately through attrition, right? When people have retired or left, we have always reevaluated our staff model and say, okay, given our financial situation, what do we need at this point in time, right? And what kind of financial investment can we make? One of the things that I can say, having done this and run all the numbers, for a new exec coming in, I have zero concerns that for the next 5 years, we're in a sustainable pattern, staffing wise, drawdown wise, budget wise. That's always my question to every congregation. Can you sustain what you have for the next 5 years? Having done this, having looked at all the numbers, having sat with Chris, I'm confident that for the next 5 years, the basic model, right, of where we're at staff wise and things like this is sustainable. It doesn't mean that when someone leaves or retires, we're not still going to continue to evaluate, but we're not in the spot where we were last time when Sheldon came on board. The drawdown on the investments was way in a not sustainable way, and we had to go through a massive staff shedding within the first couple of years. We're not in that situation like we were last time.
And not to get into personnel details, but this is also, when you say that, it's conditioned on the idea that there would be the general minister and 2 associates. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
So in this budget, that's a great question, Mark. In this budget, for that personnel cost, is the highest approved, is the number that is the highest that EC approved for the new general minister with full pastor's participation benefits. So the number we're using for budgeting is at the ceiling, not at the floor, not even in the middle. It's the highest number based on what's currently been approved by EC for the general minister.
Mark, can I just, there was a part of the Pittsburgh Presbytery Foundation, one of our members, unfortunately, who's gone on to another ministry, said she attended a workshop put on stewardship put on by the GA. And the people there said there are only 3 viable presbyteries in the United States, and we're one of them.
Yeah.
Wow.
In other words,
I'm curious, do you know what the other 2 are, Chris?
Yes, I do. Would you like to know who they are?
Is Atlanta one?
No.
Oh.
Is one, and Northern Louisiana is one. But
Northern Louisiana, and what's the second one? I'm sorry.
Charlotte.
Okay.
But we're the only ones that are viable that are solvent.
Wow.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
Most of our peer presbyteries are running on faith. I think, like we talked about that at our synod meeting that I was at last week. A lot of the presbyteries in the synod end up passing deficit budgets and basically say, well, we know we won't spend it all, so we'll pass it. Like that's what Lake Erie does. We don't have that practice, right? And I'm glad we don't, because to me that pushes you into a spot. But yeah, that's definitely been part of it.
Thank you.
All right. So what is the change for 2024? So we have had a practice for a while of aligning staff compensation increases with the increase that COM is recommending or is enacting for minimum terms of call and recommending for all our congregations. And we're continuing that practice this year of doing a staff compensation increase of 3% across the board. During COVID, we held those lower. 1 year, I was actually quite proud of our staff. We said to personnel, don't give us anything. Like, we have jobs and we're getting paid. Let's just keep them flat. And that's what we did with minimum terms of call. So I think that's been a good practice to say what we're recommending out for our churches and their pastors is what we're recommending here. The thing that I'll add that I think that needs to be named about staff is that we provide for every employee, not just myself and not just our leadership staff. Every employee is eligible for PPO medical for themselves, and then can buy in for their families. We don't have to do that. For a while, we thought about moving people to the EPO plan. Personnel looked at it in last year and said, it's just the cost difference isn't worth it. Let's pay the extra money and put everybody on PPO. So we still provide high tier medical coverage for all our employees, both minister, leadership staff, and our lay employees. One of the big changes this year, it's an internal change, but it's important. We have consolidated a lot of budget lines. One of the directives that came out of the executive committee was to de-emphasize, not get rid of the branch system, but de-emphasize it to kind of allow for greater efficiency. So we had East Branch, North Branch, West Branch, South Branch budget lines. And what they did is they put $1,500 in 4 different lines that we couldn't use unless it was for a branch event. So this year, what we've done is that we've consolidated those 4 lines. We've consolidated some other lines that were for like stewardship support and some things that, to be honest, have been in the budget for a very, very long time, even back to when the staffing model was different, right? I know why these existed, right? I know why there was a stewardship support line, because that used to be actually part of someone's job. We did a lot of consolidation of budget lines in order to allow our staff to be more efficient in how we program, right? Again, after COVID, like our branch meetings that weren't happening regularly before COVID completely stopped during it. So to continue to fund it by branch just didn't make sense. And so we did a lot of consolidation. You'll see the 4th bullet point. We consolidated that and made a jump and said, okay, well, one of the things the landscape study was very clear on was that one of the areas where people wanted additional time and funds allocated was into the equipping ministry of the church. So 2 examples of that last spring, Louise Rogers took the lead on planning an elder and deacon training event. 90 people showed up at Beulah for that event. Clearly, when we did it, people responded. We're bringing Presbyterian disaster assistance in to do a church safety seminar. It's not until the end of October. We have 62 people who are registered for it already. So when we plan these type of equipping events, people are responding. We see that, recognize that, and we've made an additional allocation. So we've consolidated those branch lines, and we're adding $10,000 into that line to really focus in 2024 on the equipping, and we've called it equipping our congregations. Now, why throw the extra 10,000 in? Isn't that a stretch? Not really. Remember how I said that that the number that's in there for the general minister is the highest number it's currently authorized to be. Even factoring in Louise's salary and the extra compensation that Ralph and Carla and I are receiving in this season, we are still below our personnel budget. So if we're going to take a stretch, if we're going to put extra money somewhere, this is a very safe year to do it, because we know we're going to be under on personnel costs, because we're not going to have a general minister here on January 1. So that's why I felt comfortable saying, let's put some extra money there. Let's devote some extra effort there. We've seen some good traction. That's what the data said. Let's go in that direction. As I said, we have a little GA related cost that's $1,500. The last thing, and this is not on the budget itself, but it is important to keep in mind, and that is that we are establishing the Family Medical Leave Fund to assist our congregations. So the most significant, a very significant change in our book of order, starting this year is 12 weeks of family medical leave is required for all our installed pastors. And what we know is that unfunded mandates are unpopular. And recognizing that this is really an unfunded mandate, and having done this work for 7 years, I've been at those meetings when the pastor says, I have been diagnosed with cancer, or I'm expecting, or my wife is expecting. And here's what happens every time. The sweet old lady, her name is normally June or Harriet, gets either super sad because the pastor has cancer, or super excited. Oh, we're so excited for you. That's so great. And then the finance guy, and it's always a guy, his name is usually Fred or Steve, goes, oh no. And I watch the face, and I can tell you who's who. I can tell you who is the fellowship committee who's already planning the party for the baby, and the finance guy who's already panicking. One of the things that will help us tremendously is if we can, in those moments, say, we know that this is a book of order requirement. We know that this is going to incur costs for the congregation. Presbytery is going to help you through this. So right now we're going to fund it with $10,000 drawn out of, or what's proposed, $10,000 to be drawn from the Presbyterian Foundation, which is a different pool of funding. But the key there is that that is going to be money that if we don't use it, is just going to stay in the funds. Because some years we might need to do 3 of these grants, and some years we might not have to do any. But for example, Vincent Kolb at 6 was diagnosed with cancer. And I had to go to a session and be like, hey, he can't work. He's under doctor's orders. And they were like, so what about the expense? Like, we want to keep paying him. And they said, can Presbytery help? And the answer was no. And that felt really awful to say, no, we can't help. Because even saying, yes, we're going to give you a grant to cover pulpit supply and a moderator will, I think, go a long way. So I'm really excited about that. I think it's really important. It's not going to cost us a lot of money, but I think as far as showing that our that Pittsburgh Presbytery is going to work for the betterment and strengthen our congregations, especially in times of challenge, I think this goes a long way. I think I forgot the most important number. I did. The thing I didn't add here is what does this all mean for per capita? What this means per capita wise is what's being proposed is a 3% increase in the presbytery part of per capita, not the overall number. If you run the math overall, it's going to be about a 1.6% increase in per capita. We have tried the last couple of years to kind of keep per capita down. 1 year it was flat. 1 year we actually reduced it because we could. I kind of made the decision this year that we need to make an increase to kind of offset some of that investment withdrawal, but also keep in mind our congregations aren't like killing it financially, and putting too much on them is just not right or fair. So to me, 3%, again, kind of in line with what we're doing on staff compensation, seemed the wisest. What I didn't want to do was I didn't want to make no increase and then have the new person come in and be like, uh-oh, now we need to do 6. That seemed also unfair. So it's not in the notes, but it's a 3% increase in the presbytery part of per capita. That's the end of my presentation, but questions, fire away. I'm going to
tell how much that 3% means.
Close the share screen now.
Oh, how much that 3% means of what our share of the per capita money coming in, Brian?
It's about what, 10,000?
No, per out of the person per person per capita rate is what, $31? This was helping out. So it'd be about $1.
Yeah, it's like 81
70-cent increase.
70 cents. Okay, thank you.
So because I think that, when you say 3%, everybody goes, but it said it's only 70 cents a person, which seems to be manageable, because I think that conveys a better idea of what we're really trying to do.
I'm sorry, it's 65 cents because GAs went down 5 cents.
That's right.
Okay.
That you had a line in there, Brian, about GA costs for the stated clerk. I know it's probably technical, but
so because our stated clerk goes to General Assembly, there's just extra travel costs. We also do something nice for the commissioners while we're there. Normally, we actually are sending 2 staff members to GA. One of the staff members who's supposed to go to General Assembly has decided his summer is better spent other ways. So we'll actually have less GA costs than we normally would, because it's just not, in this transitional role, it's not worth my time or the cost of the presbytery to go.
Gotcha. And is this the year when they're switching to online committees ahead of time and then in-person plenary?
Yes.
Okay.
And I've added those numbers of 70 cents and 65 cents overall on per capita.
I just want to say thank you. This is really helpful and it's really clear and well done. So even if you have, I mean, I know you're going to develop a streamlined thing for Presbytery, but it's really good.
Yeah, and the feedback on New Worshiping Communities is super helpful. Like, I really appreciate that. Just because that's my commission, so I'm so used to it and I know it, so I forget that a lot of people are like, that's a lot of money with not a lot of information.
Right.
That is very helpful.
Hmm.
Nancy.
Do we have enough time to answer one? How did they come up with 5 1/4 as a withdrawal number? I mean,
Yeah, that's
we're constantly
Well,
fighting over, they want to take out everything and I tell them they can't. It's like,
5% is usually the line in the sand. That usually 5%. 5% usually means that you're if you have the typical 60-40 spread of stocks versus bonds, you should be able to make 5%. A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, it came onto the floor of the Presbytery to reduce the amount to 4.5%. It got voted down pretty much unanimously. They wanted to keep it about 5%. 5 1/4 is reasonable. You remember now that we use New Covenant Trust. So basically, all our investments are really clean, very good investments, and certainly follow our book of order in how we invest in a Christian way. So I feel comfortable with it. I think it's going to be okay, particularly as the rates on bonds continue to grow. I think we'll be in good shape. One of the couple of things that you have to keep in mind is one is we own our building. We don't pay rent, we get rent. Okay, so and there may be a day when we don't have that building, but that'll be just money that we'll just have to sit on because we'll be paying it to somebody else. The other thing is the building is about 20 years old, and there are things that go down, and every now and then we just have to be there to to take care of it because we have tenants who depend on us. So there is some flexibility involved there, but basically I think you're going to find that as I said, there are only 3 solvent presbyteries in the entire United States, and we're one of them. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, and we're going to try to keep it that way.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah,
something to be proud of.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, reducing staff is not fun, but it's necessary because getting to a cliff is worse. So, any other questions? All right. Well, I appreciate all your time, and I know I'll see some of you next Thursday, and you'll get the streamlined version. But I also really appreciate you taking the time because having never done this before, I was like, I want a dry run before I present this to the whole presbytery. So thank you for being my guinea pigs. I really appreciate it.
All you got to do is put it up for a vote. You don't even have to explain anything. Just say there are any questions.
Yeah, no, that's Chris. You've worked with me long enough. That's not how I roll.
I know that. No, hey, listen. I think I would use the P News as the forum for the description of the new worshiping communities. I think it's too long a thing to have a presbytery.
Sure.
When they have a big lunch waiting for them.
Yep. So yeah. All right. Thank you.
I mean,
all.
I think you could even theoretically have a standing item in the P News. Our 4 new worshiping communities. Here's where they are and what they do. Could be very simple.
I think I'm going to mention it next week, actually, as part of the presentation, and just say there's more details on our website. It is a significant investment of ours, and here's but yeah, so that's helpful.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
All right,
Thank you so much.
Very, very good, Brian. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.